Jane's Life in Pictures has been produced and follows the volumes that have been written on her biography. You will find that the slides have some narrative, some songs, and some other features which you will enjoy. I'm very glad to have been able to make this and for you to be able to see that her life was an interesting life, a varied life, a vibrant life, and she was a wonderful woman. Hello again. As you may know, I've been writing Jane's biography, and I started writing first of all 1960 to 66, which is now the first volume. This was published in 2020 May, and it was the period up until they came back from the USA, starting with their fairly long relationship before they got married. The second volume is the intermediate years, and the Life in Pictures follows the trend of and the trail of these volumes, including her mayoral year. The council years has not yet been published, but is included in the Life in Pictures. So, in parallel with the Life in Pictures being uploaded onto YouTube, an ebook will be published rather than a hard copy, in the first instance anyway, and this will be the third volume, which will take the years from 1990 to 2090, which are called the council years. So I know a lot of you have read the first few volumes, but will be quite interested in viewing and reading some of the life of Jane during the period of 60 years, which are contained in the Life in Pictures. Hello, just to give you a further bit of information about Jane's life. It starts from 1960, although she was born in 1942. I only met her in 1960, and therefore really it's for other people to narrate her life before that, her family, for instance. There are a lot of photographs which with John, her brother, and but I think it's sensible from my point of view to start her life from probably mid-May 1960, when we first met. Thank you very much. 1960 to 1966 is described in Volume 1 of Jane Everall Baugh's biography. And it's the period from when they first met, then didn't continue for a while, and then re-met, and then from late 1960 until 1966 they were going through the period of a fairly long relationship until Peter went to the United States. Jane followed out and got married to him, and they stayed in New Orleans for 1.5 years, returning at the end of 1966 to Cardiff, where they lived for about a year until they moved to Manchester and resided in Timperley. The fact that Jane and Peter ever met can be considered to be blamed on World War II, which, if it hadn't occurred, it's quite possible that they would never have met. Jane and Peter met by chance in mid-May 1960. Jane, a schoolgirl in first year sixth form, with a friend Megan, decided to go to what was called the Hop at the Students' Union, Park Place, Cardiff, one Saturday evening. And later on in the evening, Peter came in with friends, saw these two girls sitting by the wall, and decided to ask one of them to dance, which was Jane. When they were dancing, there was a watch on the floor, and she accidentally trod on the watch, and Peter said to her, sort of in a gruff voice, "You just stepped on a watch." Probably didn't assist in what was going to be their relationship. Anyway, they met at this because she had, for the first time, coincidentally decided with a friend to go to the student union dance. I never knew why they had decided on this, but they obviously wanted to possibly be in the company of older boys than their contemporaries at school. So this was a chance occasion and was the start of 60 years of them knowing each other. And it's quite possible that it would never have continued, and it could have been all over before it had begun. The fact that it wasn't over was quite likely to have been an intervention by Jane's mother, who it looked as though she liked Peter more than the guy that Jane was actually seeing over the summer months while Peter was away. So 60 years of knowing each other started again at this point. Jane was Labour through and through, from quite an early age, and at 17 was member and chair of a young Labour group, of about five of them, fairly well in the minority where they lived, who met at the small house called the Wendy House in the middle of Rubina, close to the Garden Village, and she was the chairperson. They invited local dignitaries to speak, including councillors, and the young David Markand, I believe, was invited to speak. It was a small group, as I've said. Labour voters were in the minority in Cardiff North, the constituency where she lived. P, from unfortunately, the opposite side, voted Conservative in 1959. She didn't know it until afterwards because she hadn't met him in that year. She showed her political colours in no uncertain terms one Saturday evening. After all, it was Saturday, and P thought, as usual, they were going to go out for the evening. However, J had different ideas, as her father was attending a meeting in Cardiff at which Harold Wilson, the future Prime Minister in 1964, was speaking. J decided he wished to accompany her father. P was a little disappointed and selfishly did not consider what J wished to do. On that evening, she demonstrated that politics was more important than going out with a boyfriend who she'd be only dating for about 12 months. Peter did regret later that he did not accompany them, but his politics had not really developed to an extent at that stage, and never was likely to be as important to him as it was to Jane. Meanwhile, Peter played Chopin pieces for her mother on the piano. Her parents had purchased Jill, her sister, a piano for her to learn to play. Jane was always considerate, and as I've said already, purchased the book of 19 nocturnes, ambitiously thinking that Peter would be sufficiently proficient to play these pieces, which he struggled to do so for many years to come. Jane first visited Colwyn Bay over a year after they'd met. She'd met Peter's parents on one occasion when Peter was graduating in July 1960, but she didn't actually visit Colwyn Bay until August 1961. It was the results of her A-level exams, the week of the results, and they had a phone call from her father, and he informed her that she had passed. And Jane and Peter decided to check in the results in the Liverpool Post at the local library, where to her distress they found that she had only achieved O-level passes in the A-level exams. She had hoped to enter Cardiff School of Medicine, which was doubly disappointing. In the evening, Jane and Peter and family members attended her future sister-in-law Juliet's 21st birthday celebration. It was not a good evening for Jane, as you can be imagined. She was fairly well among people that she did not know, on her own, without her family. And but an interesting suggestion came from Juliet, because Juliet had started a physiotherapy training program. And Juliet said, "Why don't you consider physiotherapy as a career?" So it was due to the fact that her future sister-in-law had made this suggestion that Jane went back to Cardiff, took the advice on board, and applied to the School of Physiotherapy attached to Cardiff Medical School. She was accepted and commenced a 3-year course in October 1961, a few months later. So commenced her long career in physiotherapy, which ended in 2012. Contains an official photograph of Jane with her family in the early 1960s. The small photograph to the side is a photograph of her with a brother and sister. Jane's around 16 years old and her sister is about 11. So this is a very nice family photo shot. Several interesting interludes, if you like, in the 1962-63 period. One quite almost disastrous was concerned with Jane suffering very badly from nosebleeds, and Jane and Peter decided one day to go out to Penarth, about 5 miles from Cardiff Centre. They caught the local train from Queen Street Station, having caught the bus from Robina, and on alighting at Penarth Station a little later, they proceeded to walk in the direction of the seafront. Before they were able to reach their destination, disaster overtook Jay, and she experienced the severest nosebleed imaginable. What to do to combat this serious situation? Peter, with Jay bloodied, rushed back to the station to catch the next train and proceeded by taxi to take them back to a home for her to lie down. Her father, I say, expressed his gratitude to Peter, and he may, on reflection, have instigated the rapid return by taxi. Another interlude, which was one of those situations which was a cause of severe reprimand to both of them, was going out to a friend's apartment to have a good evening. With all work and no play was not a feature of their long relationship. They had a pretty good social life and partied as much as possible, but mainly at weekends and midweek. On one occasion, they were invited to a party, and they had no idea the time it whisked by. But when they realised that the time advanced beyond 2 a.m., Peter thought he should escort Jane home. At about 3 a.m., when approaching Jay's house, Jay had an awful thought. Where was her house key? She couldn't find it. So what to do? Was there a window that could be opened? The side door to the garden and access to kitchen and back bedroom windows was bolted. The lounge bay windows were fast. The only window that could be forced was in the front bay of the bedroom where her parents were sleeping. Without hesitation, impetuously, Jay decided that the only course of action was to break in and hopefully not to disturb her parents, a futile idea. As you can imagine, she was severely reprimanded for intrusion, and Peter was given a lecture by her father while walking the dog on a following evening. She did not repeat this folly and never forgot a house key again. Not true later in life, as she broke into 121 Moss Lane, Timperley, by smashing a window near to the back door. Taylor Warner, one of her physio classmates, visited Scotland in 1962 and returned to Port Seton. where Jane had lived from her birth in 1942 until 1946. And they stayed with Aunt Mary, who wasn't a real aunt, but who looked after her during World War II. They had a very active holiday and many occasions on the beach, and also because they were in Scotland, they did buy kilts, which are depicted on the left-hand side. Jane and Peter with Jill, Sheila's mother, and Liz and Sheila often visited the beach near to where Sheila's mother lived. And Ogmore was one beach that they visited in the 1960s. So this was a beach party occasion in which they very much enjoyed themselves. Jane pretty well always knew what she wanted, and when she informed Peter that she would like a silver bracelet as a 21st birthday present, he visited a local jeweller's in St Mary Street, Cardiff, and he chose what he considered was a suitable bracelet. But when he presented it to Jane, she showed some displeasure, as it was narrower than she expected. She pretty well said and demanded that P return to the jeweller's to obtain a wider bracelet, which was quite a lot more expensive, more than £10, and considering at this time, 1963, he was probably on something around £7 a week as a research student, which was not a lot of money. So he was landed with a greater expense than expected. It, as I say, it was all of £10, with extra for the engraving. So this Jane had expensive taste, and the bracelet cost more than a week's grant money. P was not too pleased, but accepted his lot. The physios decided to join a students' union, and it was the University of Wales Institute of Science and Technology Union that they went to, because they weren't affiliated to the University College or the medical school. So the gang of four, who were notorious in the physiotherapy group, including Jane, decided to approach the president of the US Students' Union. So they made an appointment to see him. After entering his office, his first comment was to ask them cynically if they were basket makers. They were, as you can imagine, instantly to take a dislike to this pompous president. However, interestingly, they were accepted and obtained US Union cards as a result. He was to become a long-time friend of J and P until his untimely death in 1992, aged 51, as he married Liz, one of the Gang of Four, in 1968. After UIST and the University College merged and the Alumni Association was formed, Jane became a member as a past student. For some reason, Peter did not, although he studied in the Department of Chemistry for 7 years. She continued to receive the alumni news until she died. After, Peter made a gesture by donating to Cardiff University in memory of Jane, and as a result became a member of Silkiades. During the time Jane was sort of a sixth former, and also later when she was a physio student training during the 1960s, she worked on a Saturday at an agency in St Mary Street with her dad. and reported on football and rugby matches, collating results and sometimes reporting on matches. She informed Peter that the reports were usually written by listening to the spectators' comments. She was paid 10 shillings, about 50 pence, for this. In the early evenings, Jay and Pete usually met up on a corner of opposite Cardiff Castle, and Pete, on occasions, waited for up to an hour for Jane to appear because she was late from reporting on matches. On at least one occasion, when Jay appeared across the road from Peter, because of her short-sightedness and unwillingness to wear her glasses, she would make a beeline for who she thought was Peter and approach a complete stranger with a greeting intended for Peter, only to realise at the final moment her mistake. After meeting, they would frequently go for a drink at a local cinema or dance at the Hop. Jane used to hate waiting for a bus to return home from having a drink, etc., and particularly in winter. She was known to mutter, "Why don't you buy a car?" Peter ignored this plea as he knew that on a grant of less than £7 a week he could afford to make the purchase. He did, however, take driving lessons and passed his test, but Jane remained a little disappointed because he couldn't hire a car for over a year. She also worked in the summer months at the Salary and Wages Department of Cardiff Transport, a job which, as always, her father secured for her. Unfortunately, when presenting the busmen with their wages on Fridays, she was known not to have calculated stoppages correctly, which caused the recipients some consternation. However, she won through, as they could not harangue a female with such striking features. Jane and some physiotherapies, including the Gang of Four, the notorious group of physios, had a week away in Spain. The weather wasn't great. In fact, she said that the weather was fairly rainy the whole time and overcast. Anyway, it looks on this occasion they were on the beach and the sun is shining. She did comment that after some late nights that one of the physios had actually slept in the bath at the hotel. But that wasn't Jane. Jane and Peter attended the wedding of Judy and Tim. Tim was a research student in another lab in the Department of Chemistry, but was a good friend, and they played golf together. Anyway, Tim asked Peter to be best man rather than his own brothers. Peter was able to reciprocate when he went to America and Jane and Peter got married in America, because Tim had actually gone out to Princeton, New Jersey, not far away, to do some research, and he was able to attend the wedding in Trenton, New Jersey, and Peter, as a result, asked him to be best man at the wedding. So this was very fortuitous that there was an exchange of best men on these two occasions, July 1964 and April 1965. Before Peter left for the USA, Jane and Peter had a holiday away with Sheila Warner, one of her physio friends, and her boyfriend Mike Abbott, who possessed a Wolseley 1500. And the four of them drove to Scotland to visit Auntie Mary at Portsea, and again to stay in the barracks. Whereas the girls were well accommodated in a bedroom with a double bed, the boys had to sleep for the whole fortnight in a 3-foot bed with no space to turn over. It was, as you can imagine, excruciatingly difficult. There was respite, because the couples had one night away in Fort William in a B&B, the girls in one room and the boys in another. There was no swapping of rooms from B and B and G to B and G on this occasion. Peter and Jane didn't get engaged until August 1964, and he was due to leave for the USA in November. So Jane's mother said to her, "You had better get engaged before he departs." John, Jane's brother, had been an apprentice jeweller in the city, and Peter approached the jeweller to get an engagement ring. It was not to be any old ring, but one of white gold with a large, slightly oblong sapphire set in diamonds. Knockdown price £75. This ring was very costly to P, who had only received an increasing grant to a little under £9 a week for his final year. However, his salary in the USA was to be more than compensate for this outlay. A platinum wedding ring was also made by the jeweller at a cost of £20. As a result, P, on one Sunday afternoon in August 1964, proposed to Jane with permission from her father. This was a pretty long time to wait to get engaged, 4 years since they first met. The first step on the road to marriage, the engagement, had finally been achieved. What was the next step going to be? Jay was now thinking fast. "Dad, I'm going to marry Pete before he goes." A blunt reply comes back from her dad. "No, you are not, as you have to concentrate on and pass your physio exams in November." Jay's mind is now in a whirl, and tempestuously she says to her dad, "If that is the situation, I'm going over to America to marry him after I have finished and passed my exams." Her dad, and also with her mother, agree, and that is exactly what Jay did. In mid-November 1964, P departed for the USA, several weeks prior to Jay's physio exams in London. The departing was difficult for both of them, as they would not be reunited for more than 5 months. The next step to their marriage was achieved as Jay passed her physio exams in late November. In the following 5 months, she had the difficult task of organising her departure to the USA. As a result of a recruitment notice in the UK promoted by an English physiotherapist at Truro Infirmary in New Orleans, she had been offered a post as a physical therapist. She was fortunate in that Louisiana was one of the states in which state examinations for physical therapy were not required. An application for a green card was also required to allow her to work in the USA, in fact emigrate, which involved a submission to the American Embassy in London. Furthermore, she had to organise buying her wedding outfit and trousseau with her mother, and make arrangements for flying to the USA with her mother and father-in-law, who had decided to accompany her, to ensure that P honoured his commitment, it was said. Her own mother and father were not in a position to make the journey, but accepted her decision graciously. Her airfare of around £90 was paid by P from the substantial US salary he was receiving. Jay left Cardiff and was driven to Colwyn Bay by her brother John, and this happened around April 17, 1965, where she met up with her mother and father-in-law, who were to accompany her to the USA for the wedding. They departed for the USA from Manchester Ringway Airport on around April the 18th by BOAC and arrived at New York. How they proceeded from New York to Trenton, New Jersey is not exactly clear, but they could have flown to Philadelphia or gone by train. They were met by Lillian and Al Newbanks. Lillian was Peter's second cousin and his mother's first cousin. Jane was provided with accommodation for the mother and father-in-law and Jane until the day of the wedding. In the meantime, P flew from New Orleans to Philadelphia on April the 20th and was met by Tim and Judy, who were to accommodate him until the wedding day. J and P met up on April the 21st, the first day for more than 5 months, and it felt somewhat strange and uneasy for them both. How would they react? There was no place for privacy, and in the evening they crept outside to sit in the back of Tim's car for a short reunion. Jay had the experience of an American shower, complete with umbrella, women only of course, while P and Tim went for a well-earned beer. Several days prior to the wedding, the couple visited the church to discuss the service and their marriage vows with Reverend Roger. J and P also visited the town centre to have blood tests taken and to the local registry to obtain a marriage licence. Jay was extremely perturbed when the line they were standing in was also for dog licenses, and even more so when she realised that the charge was the same, $7.50, approximately £2.67. American weddings were preceded by a shower, so this was a unique occasion for Jane and for Peter, and this slide shows them together with the shower umbrella. On April the 23rd, 1965, he wasn't supposed to be present. It was supposed to be an all-women's occasion, which was a preceding of the hen parties now.
I've got you under my skin. I've got you deep in the heart of me. So deep in my heart, you're really a part of me. I've got you under my skin. I tried so not to give in. I said to myself, this affair will never go well. Why should I try? I know so well. I've got you under my skin. Sacrifice anything, what might, for the sake of fear, in spite of warning, and that comes tonight. The beating and heat in my ear. Do you hear, little fool? Never give in. Use your mentality. Wake up to reality. But each time
The day of the wedding on April the 24th, 1965, was very, very pleasant. Cool breeze, bright sunshine, and temperatures very acceptable. Unfortunately, for the few days that Jane was in Trenton, she had the unfortunate experience of having to sleep in the same bedroom as her mother-in-law, Elsie. And this happened on the eve of a wedding day. Also, Elsie never appreciated how long Jay took to get ready to go out on any occasion. And on the morning of the wedding day, this was to be no different, guessing probably longer. The wedding was held at St. James's Episcopal Church in Trenton at 11 a.m. P had been waiting patiently in the vestry when Father Rose remarked casually, would P rather go fishing? P, with his best man, Tim, proceeded to the altar to await Jay's arrival. After a short while, Jay arrived in Al's car, accompanied by Tom, P's second cousin, the brother of Lillian, who, in the absence of her father, was to give her away. The ceremony proceeded and they exchanged vows and retired to the vestry to sign the church register, with Tim and Judy as their witnesses. They were now man and wife. It was worth noting that at a fairly young age of 22, when Jay was married in the USA, none of her relations, including her mother and father, were present. Of the 17 guests, only her mother and father-in-law, Tim and Judy, currently in Princeton, and a friend of Jay's, Jane Thomas, who was studying at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore, were from the UK. The remaining 12 of the guests comprised P's American relatives and several close friends. These are a selection of the official photographs taken by a professional photographer on the day of the wedding. And this was actually the most expensive part of the wedding. It was actually more expensive than the wedding reception. This slide shows several photographs in colour taken by the guests, or one of the guests, and it is in the grounds of the Washington Crossing Inn on the Delaware. And this is where Washington crossed the Delaware to defeat the British in the American War of Independence in 1776. The video of Jane and Peter's wedding on April 24th resulted from a cine camera film taken by Peter's mother, who had borrowed an 8mm cine camera from a friend. And she was not experienced in actually taking cine films. And as you can see, there's a lot of unedited features in it. And what has been cut out was that about a minute of the actual film was spent taking pictures out of the porthole of the aircraft on the way to the USA. So unfortunately, this is a problem for the actual video, and also at one stage light gets in. So it's very much a practice run, and it had to be the final run combined. But I think you can see that this was quite a delightful occasion, and Jane looked pretty happy and, exuberant at the wedding. And at the end, which is shown in the slide corner on the left-hand side, her final picture is fantastic. Peter had miscalculated the departure time of the plane from Philadelphia, and the couple had to dash to the airport with Tim Lee driving them there. And Tim very courteously took a photograph of the plane. The plane was waiting for this couple, the two people, to arrive, and as it was past the time of arrival by about 15 minutes, the airline attendant had to carry the bags to the plane for them. Peter actually told the airline steward that they were a newly married couple, but the airline were fairly unimpressed by this, and they received no bottle of champagne. Hello everybody. On the first night of the marriage, Peter got the food in and served up TV dinners with baked potato, etc., and pink champagne from New York State. So this was their first night, their honeymoon breakfast, if you like, on their own, 2900 St. Charles Avenue, New Orleans. Jane never been away from home, age 22. She said later that she never felt homesick. Peter and Jane's honeymoon was spent several days after they'd arrived in New Orleans at the resort near Biloxi, Mississippi, the Mississippi Gulf Coast. And as you can see, there's a map of the Gulf Coast, and so they drove from New Orleans to the Gulf Coast and spent several days going sightseeing in Mississippi and on to Alabama and into the area of Mobile, where they actually saw the SS Alabama in the actual bay. One of the features of their visit was to visit Jefferson Davis's house, who was the president of the Confederacy. This would be viewed as fairly controversial now. In Katrina, the house was fairly badly damaged, as was the whole of the Mississippi Gulf Coast. I mean, quite a lot of it that Jane and Peter had seen when they visited in 2005 was in absolute ruins and decimated. So this was a little bit unfortunate. On the first day of their honeymoon, Peter had to go to Canal Street to pick up a car, and as you know, they drive on the wrong side of the road in USA, and he picked up one of the smallest cars he could find, which was a VW Beetle, left-hand drive, manual control, never previously experienced by him. He had to drive on one of the widest boulevards in the USA back to pick Jane up from the apartment. So negotiating going on the right side of the road up Canal Boulevard and then back down towards St. Charles Avenue must have been quite an interesting experience for him. Depicted here is Jane's identity card, employee's identity card, which was for Truro Infirmary employment. You note that it's Jane L. Baugh, but it's actually a mistake. It should be Jane E. Baugh. And she was in the Department of Physical Medicine, and she had to carry this card to identify herself as an employee. She had a salary which was about 3 times the salary of her that she would have expected in the UK. Unfortunately, she had a bit of a disappointment in that after a medical examination, she was not allowed to start work until May, although she had arrived in April. So it was towards the end of May, in fact, that she was allowed to work. And this was because of a slight problem after her getting married, which I will not elaborate on. After the first month that he spent at 2900 St. Charles Avenue, Jane decided that she would want to move. And she found an apartment at 3550 Coliseum Street, which was closer to Truro Infirmary, so she could fall out of bed at 7:30 in the morning, and by 8 o'clock she could get to the infirmary, which was 2 blocks away. So the reason for leaving the other apartment was that it was invaded by cockroaches every evening after they had had their meal and they had left plates in the sink. So it was a bit of an older apartment, and the new one had a swimming pool as well and a barbecue area. So it was much more appropriate than the first apartment. When Jane and Peter first went shopping for groceries, they didn't have a car, and they walked from their apartment on St. Charles Avenue to Winn-Dixie store, a few blocks away. Seeing a couple carrying groceries in large brown paper bags was an unusual sight for native New Orleanians, as virtually no one used the sidewalks. On one occasion, after finishing shopping and on leaving the store, they were approached by a boy of about 12 to 13 years of age, who asked if he could carry their bags of groceries. They agreed and handed the bags over to him. He was a little dismayed when they commenced walking down the street and not returning to the supermarket car park. They informed him that they had not got a car and had walked from their apartment a few blocks away. After some thought, the boy agreed to carry their groceries the several blocks back to their apartment. He was adequately rewarded by Jane and Peter for carrying the groceries, the extra distance, but it was an experience he had not anticipated. At the end of May, Peter, with a friend, went to the car lot across the Mississippi to buy a second-hand car. And he saw a car which looked suitable, and it had air conditioning, it was automatic, so it would have been appropriate for him to purchase it. He looked at it at the car lot And then the guy, who was a bit of a sharp, brought it to the lab for him to look at again, and he finally bought it. It was then checked over, not very well, by the car lot guy, and he brought it home. And when Jane saw it, she said, "It's too big, I can't cope with it, you'll have to take it back." But I said to her, "It's got air conditioning, so you'll be okay." So after a while she calmed down and accepted it, and they drove 20,000 miles in this car over the next year and a half. This slide shows some further photographs of Jane and Peter in their second apartment, and also in the centre bottom a group of friends with them, particular friends: Tony, Wells, John, and Glenda, and also Jane. Photograph is taken by Peter. This was a pleasant area to sit in and have a barbecue and swim after work. Jane and Peter were very fortunate that a few miles away at the lakeside there was a man-made beach, and they spent a lot of time at this beach with friends, going out to the restaurants, but just sitting on the beach, having picnics and swimming. And this was done on very frequent occasions. They met up with good friends who took them out, and also introduced them to trick or treat at the end of October, which Jane took part in, ran round the block with two 12-year-olds, and enjoyed trick or treating for that time. This slide is a continuation of the previous one and shows Jane and Peter relaxing on the beach with friends, strolling along the beach, and generally having a great time. I mean, it was really the whole of their time in New Orleans was party time, trip time, you name it, they did it. And going down to the French Quarter after parties late at night was part of the scene. In September 1965, Jane and Peter were downtown in their apartment and experienced the worst hurricane in living memory up to that date, and it was named Betsy. They returned to New Orleans in 2005, 40 years later, about 5 months before Katrina, so it was ironic that there was 40 years between two disastrous hurricanes. And this year also New Orleans experienced quite a severe hurricane. They were really quite upset because they were on the ground floor and they thought there might be a flood. So they did ask the manager if they could move upstairs. Anyway, they sat it out for about 10 hours, and they were aware of the eye passing over because the wind speed dropped dramatically. They could hear hoarding and sort of roofing flying about outside. They didn't actually open the door at all, but they listened to the radio as long as they could. So in the morning, the speed had dropped, and they went outside and saw that the car had been quite severely damaged. The back rear window had been smashed out and two other windows had been smashed. They didn't have any electricity, but they did have gas, so they were quite lucky they were able to cook food. Other areas, including the area where Peter's boss lived, had no power for a week, so all food in freezers was lost, and food was wasted, and I think many people had barbecues nearly every evening. So this was quite an experience for them, and Jane had only been in the country about 5 months, so to have this sort of experience was quite a disaster. This slide shows the aftermath of Hurricane Betsy. The center photo shows the car with the door open, the back window is smashed, and the two side windows have been smashed as well. And there was various chipping of the paintwork, etc. On the right top, there's the gridlock at the traffic lights, and the other photographs show debris on the pavements, the sidewalks, etc. And the swimming pool area looked fairly well damaged, with the hoarding coming down and everything sort of being this slide shows Peter and Jane in their apartment with friends, the centre photo, and these were relations of Peter's boss from California, and also an English guy in the back between the two friends was Andy, who they went to the wedding of Andy and his partner when they got back to the UK. Jane and Peter in their breakfast bar on the right, and Jane is relaxing in front of the apartment on the left side, which you could do on many occasions right through the winter months, because the weather could be as much as 20 to 25 centigrade in the winter, although it could also freeze early morning, but it warmed up during the day to an equitable temperature. What did Jane do after work on a Saturday afternoon when Peter was on the golf course, as he was almost every Saturday through the time that they were in New Orleans? Well, she worked until 1 o'clock, and then she needed to find something to do afterwards. With several physios, she decided that they would treat themselves to celebrate the end of the week. This resulted in them lunching at a renowned restaurant, Commander's Palace, on Washington Avenue in the Garden District, where they lived, only a short walk from the apartment. These lunches were special, no ordinary fare, as they comprise of vodka martinis to assist with the consumption of half a dozen cooked oysters in half shells on rock salt, prepared with Rockefeller, Bienville, and Commander's Palace sauces. As a result of these gourmet outings, when P returned from golf, he frequently found that Jane was fast asleep in bed, looking satisfied. So this story tells you that she did enjoy oysters when cooked, but she lost her appetite for shellfish later in life.
In the still of the night, as
After Jane had been there for about 5 months or so, in October, Glenda from Cardiff, not in the same year as Jane, decided to come out to join her to spend a year as a physical therapist in the department in Truro Infirmary. This is a photograph of them both, Glenda posing as the patient and Jane on the point of treating her. They had some interesting experiences during this period, and Jane had been asked to take up crutches to the top floor and leave them outside the door of the actual area. And this was because it was a ward for black people. She was told not to go in, and that was the situation. When the restaurant was desegregated so that black and white people could go into the restaurant, as usual, Jane and Glenda went to the restaurant and had a meal. When they returned to the department, they were criticised by the admin staff for eating in the restaurant. We were aware in New Orleans at that time that it was like apartheid in South Africa, and we could not have black people as friends. We couldn't invite them to our apartment, and the only contact we had with black people was in the street, or Jane had a little bit more contact because the orderlies, who were well qualified and more qualified than she was, were black. About 70 miles up the river road from New Orleans was the state capital, Baton Rouge. And they went to Baton Rouge via what was called, appropriately, the river road, and passed by the Hugh P. Long Bridge. Louisiana was unique in that the Capitol building was not the same architectural type as the federal Capitol in Washington, like most other state capitals. It was an Art Deco building with a central tower, which was well worth visiting, and it was well worth going up the tower and viewing the gardens from the state capitol. Also on the steps there was a plaque indicating where the governor of Louisiana, the US Senator Hugh P. Long Jr., was assassinated by gunshot in 1935, and the bullet holes of the shooting were still evident. New Orleans had been the center of jazz from the early 1900s, in fact as far back as 1905. By the time Jane and Peter were there in the mid-60s, a lot of the jazz people, the black people who originated the jazz, had gone to the north, particularly the Chicago area, including Louis Armstrong and King Oliver and others. There was one spot on St. Peter Street in the French Quarter which was devoted to jazz and designed to retain the origins and mood of jazz, and that was Preservation Hall, which originated about 4 years before they arrived in New Orleans. So J&P with friends frequented this venue on a number of occasions and listened to black musicians, mainly in their 60s and 70s, and there were various jazz bands, including the one shown here. The entry at that time was $1, and the audience was predominantly white, indicating that it was okay for the jazz group to be black, but there was still the point about the black people not attending to um, to take part in the actual jazz themselves as an audience. This photograph was taken as Jane was turning round on the cruise boat, the SS Natchez, on the Mississippi River. And Jane and Peter had taken a cruise on the boat, and Jane decided to stick her tongue out. So I decided that this was a good photograph to show her in a cheeky mood, and this happened on frequent occasions when she felt a bit jolly about things. Peter was given the opportunity to remain in the postdoctoral post for a second year, which dismayed Jane as she understood at the outset of her decision to marry in the USA that P's post was for a year, and they would be returning home in November 1965. She had made this promise to her parents. Well, P had a little difficulty in persuading J of the advantage of remaining in New Orleans for a further year, one of which was his rise in salary to more than $10,000 per annum, which was considerably more than also for her that she would have earned in the UK. So their annual salary was, by American standards, quite high. J was immediately considering that if that was the case, and she was probably quite curt in informing him that she would wish to fly back to the UK for Christmas and New Year if that was his decision, so that she could keep a promise to see her parents at least for a short period. This decision was quite difficult for P and caused him considerable pain, as J earlier in the year, possibly during August, had suggested they have a holiday south of the border down Mexico way. P informed J that he was not allowed to re-enter the US after the 9-month period, which commenced on his arrival in mid-November 1964. He would have to reapply to re-enter the USA. She accepted this excuse at the time, but with her wanting to return to the UK at Christmas time 1965, his visa would not allow him to re-enter. So what did he have to do? He had to work hard getting all the paperwork in place, which involved contacting the immigration authorities in the port of New Orleans, so the application for re-entry could be made at the American Embassy in London during the period they were in the UK. What a prospect for me, and a worry for the whole 3 weeks they were there. Anyway, they did return, and the paperwork was sent on to the embassy. Peter was going to send his his passport to the embassy, but unfortunately the time period really was short, and on advice by the staff in the American embassy, they advised him to bring his passport in on the day they were departing for the USA and get it stamped then. So that is what happened. On the morning they arrived at the American embassy about 11 o'clock and proceeded to get the passport stamped so he could re-enter the USA. So they were departing around about 2 in the afternoon. Jane, on a green card, as it happened of course, could have gone back to the USA without him if he hadn't got his passport re-stamped. But that wouldn't have been good after 8 months of marriage. And fortunately, that was not to happen. But Peter expected the unexpected from Jane. February 1966 was a special occasion, um, as it was Mardi Gras, which lasted for a few days or so. And Jane and friends decided to take part on one of the Saturdays. And they decided to dress up as the Munsters. And you can see the pictures here. First of all, at the outside the apartment, with Jane's face virtually hidden. There's a number of people there where the photograph is taken by Peter, so I think another physio's there, Glenda's there, a physio, and friends from various um, apartments in the block. And during the event, they decided to follow a parade. Well, that caused a real problem because Tony, who'd had a few beers, I think, decided to follow the parade. And this was not allowed. You could stand on the side, walk, and watch the parade go by, but you couldn't follow it. You couldn't sort of run behind it. So what happened to him? Two guys got out of a squad car, the city police, and got hold of him and put him up against the wall, frisked him, and really made him feel a bit uncomfortable. Anyway, he was released without caution, with a caution, and without being arrested. So this was part of the scene which they experienced. In addition to this, they were invited to balls, what they called crews. The different um, groups were called crews that actually arranged these floats. And there were black crews and white crews separately. But Jane and Peter had to dress up in dinner suit and long dress, etc., which was actually her converted wedding dress with a skirt. And they were allowed to go, but they weren't allowed to dance. They were only there as observers, which was a bit unfortunate because obviously being able to dance would have been much more exciting than just observing the crew members dancing. Jane and Peter with friends went on trips at weekends in the Bel Air Chevrolet, and on this occasion they decided to go west, but didn't reach the Texas border, but had a trip of around 400 miles. On the way they stopped at Morgan City, but before that Tony, who was with them, and Glenda, Jane's physio friend, Tony decided to take a picture on the Mississippi River Bridge early morning. There was no traffic on the bridge, and he took a photograph. Stopping on the bridge was strictly forbidden, and he was very fortunate that there was no squad cars seeing this car stop on the bridge for someone to take a photograph. That would have been a serious incident and instant arrest for the four of them. So they were lucky. They went on and had breakfast about 8 o'clock. Later on in the trip, they came across in fairly murky conditions a fairly unique island called Avery Island. And what was special about this island? Well, if you look at a Tabasco sauce uh, bottle, you will see under McElhenney.co Avery Island, LA. And in fact, they'd actually arrived at the island where McElhenney's Tabasco sauce was actually manufactured. This was not expected, and it was a treat for them. So ever since, they've had Tabasco sauce as an additive to various foods that they have prepared. So this was a very interesting trip, and very much enjoyed by the four of them. On another occasion, Jane with Peter, Glenda, and Tony and John, another colleague from the USDA lab, went on a trip around about 500 odd miles on a weekend to Vicksburg, Mississippi. And this was of particular interest because it was the site of a Civil War battle in 1863. They didn't arrive that early, but some photos were taken, as you can see, near a gun carriage, looking towards the sun, and then running across the grassed over trenches. And this was quite an interesting trip. However, it was unfortunately in the evening. They had not realised that they were in a dry county. There were no bars at which to drink or alcohol served at the hotel where they were staying. They received some advice and were directed to a club nearby, and they were admitted for a small fee. But there was no bar. The only way that drinks were served were in screw cap bottles for them to open at the table. So they had an interesting evening out with a meal, but had appreciated that not everywhere was like New Orleans. Jane and Peter decided to go on a short trip of about 5 days to the Smoky Mountains in Tennessee. And they stayed one night in Birmingham, Alabama, at a motel downtown, Holiday Inn, and were treated to a show in the street in that town. They then went on to Chattanooga, stayed several nights in the Chattanooga area, and during that period went up to the Lookout area, which is on the left, the Seven States Lookout at Chattanooga, Tennessee. Jane on a rope bridge, posing in a car park with the Smoky Mountains in the background, and also in the centre, although you can't see it, but there's a black spot in the middle, a black bear. And they pulled up, and the bear was on the grass verge when they pulled up, but unfortunately, some tourists, and they were not European tourists, they were USA tourists, whooped up, whooped, and frightened it off. And Jane was quite upset that they could only just spot the black bear in the distance, disappearing into the woodland. The photograph on the right bottom is of a ski lift trip, which they went, and the view of Gatlinburg. Glenda with Peter and Jane and John went for a short weekend to Fort Walton near Pensacola, and it was an excellent place for swimming. As you can see, the beaches were fantastic, and they went for a swim, and they swam out a little way from the beach, a couple of 100 yards or so, and they were lazily swimming around, enjoying themselves, not noticing that people on the beach were sort of at the water's edge, waving frantically in an attempt to warn them that they were in danger. It was not until they swam back to the beach that they had realised that there were large shapes in the water, close to where they had been swimming. John had not wanted to alarm Jay and Glenda, but he told them and P afterwards that he was aware of these creatures, perhaps 12 feet long. They had unknowingly been basking with sharks. They retired to sunbathe on the beach and did not swim again, and had a more relaxed evening. Jane and Peter had the experience of swimming in a swamp area because his boss's boss, John Guthrie, and his partner had a house in the swamps. So they arrived by Chevrolet in the morning, and they were with Glenda and John. They were greeted by the owners near their home in a secluded swamp area. On the path to the house was a carpet of grasshoppers coloured orange and black, stretching across the path, so many that it was difficult to avoid stamping on them. They changed into swimsuits to enjoy swimming in the Pearl River. The water was about 50 feet deep, they were informed, and was cool, but very refreshing. They were also told, with some humour, that the water was far too cold for them to be swimming in the presence of water moccasins, poisonous snakes, indigenous to the swampy areas of the southern states. John somewhat successfully tried to water ski, but the boat engine was not sufficiently powerful to allow him to stand upright on the skis. After their refreshing swim, they were treated to a delicious southern lunch, always with chicken cooked Louisiana style. Since they were in a swampy area, there were many insects of various types, including mosquitoes, and the door to the house had an outer mesh-covered frame to keep out unwanted insects. However, J and P observed that the mesh was almost completely covered with horseflies that obviously could sense the smell of the food. They digested the meal with slight unease feeling, and were so glad that the mesh was protecting them from an invasion of insects. This slide depicts Jane and Glenda with Mr. Landry, Mrs. Totty standing, and one of the other secretaries, administrative personnel, sitting. On the right hand side you can see they are treating a patient, Glenda and Jane. The interesting thing was that the two people, the administrative people, were the people that actually criticised Jane and Glenda for going in the desegregated restaurant. But it was interesting also that you know that the Second Amendment allows all USA people to carry arms. And Jane once commented that actually Mrs. Totty, who was standing, had a small revolver in her handbag, so indicating that she had the right to bear arms. Unlike postdoctoral workers at research institute universities, P, in government employment, was only allowed 2 weeks vacation per annum on the grade he was on, and due to the fact he was on short-term 12-month contract, it increased to 24 months. If he wished to take further days off or weeks off, he could do so without pay. As a result, their vacation breaks were shorter, of 5 to 8 days duration. This meant they were unable to take long trips because they meant distances required to tour the USA. Going west was impossible, 300 miles to the Louisiana border to the north and more than 900 miles across Texas. And there would still be about 1,000 miles from the west coast and San Francisco. To fly long distance meant missing out stopping at intervals at beauty spots and places of interest along the route. Going north also presented problems as it was 300 miles to the Louisiana state border. They had toured to the northeast as far as Tennessee and the Carolinas on their first anniversary, had managed to drive in a circular tour of about 1,000 miles in 5 days. Due east, therefore, was the only option, and they gave themselves 8 days to visit Florida and spend 3 days in the Miami area. On the first day, they travelled about 450 miles to the capital, Tallahassee, staying in a Holiday Inn, arriving well into the evening. The next day, they drove 300 miles to Jacksonville on the east Florida coast and stayed near St. Augustine, where they visited the oldest wooden schoolhouse in the USA, dating from around 1700. The next stop was Cocoa Beach near Cape Canaveral. While on the beach in the morning with many other sightseers, they could view the launch of the Gemini 11 and hear the roar of the rocket engines. Although they were not close enough to see the Saturn rocket, they were able to observe the trail in the sky in the distance above the launch. They had their leisure time at Miami Beach, and on the way home they stopped at Silver Springs, which had this lake with very, very clear water, and it was the Florida site of the Sea Hunt TV series with Lloyd Bridges. For those who can remember the series in black and white in the 1960s, and they were able to view the long distance underwater because of the glass bottom boat that they were actually cruising around the lake in. While staying at Miami Beach, they went downtown to the Carillon Hotel, which had a nightclub, and they had a meal there and we watched a show. So they went night clubbing on one occasion when they were in Miami and the Miami Beach area. This was around September 1966, 2 months before they were due to depart for the UK. Jane and Peter were treated to a farewell party by very good hosts, Jet and Laverne Arthur, and they invited colleagues from the lab that Peter worked at, and also from the physical medicine department at Tour Infirmary. So it was an important occasion, very much towards the end of their stay in America, where they were shown very generous and courteous hospitality by all the people they met. They could always, because the accents were so different to their own, they almost come, "We love your English accent," which was nice to hear. And the second group of photos is of Oscar and Elaine on the left, I should say, and Peter and Jane on the right, in the kitchen diner of 3550 Coliseum Street. They were at the farewell party, but I thought I'd actually finish off with this these photos of friends for life. When Peter and Jane bade their farewell to New Orleans from New Orleans International Airport, they were bound for Washington, D.C. That was because Peter had managed to get an interview with the civil service at the British Embassy. So the civil service paid his flight to Washington and also for one night stay, and that was at the Sheraton Charles. The second night they went round to the Manchester Hotel, which was a fairly old hotel with clanking radiators all night, but it was a lot cheaper than the Sheraton Charles. It gave them a wonderful opportunity to explore the capital, taking in the Jefferson Memorial, the Washington Monument 550, which they ascended, the White House and the Capitol complex. So there's some very good photographs, and the centre one in front of us, War Memorial, is of Jane on her last few days in the USA. Jane arrived in Trenton from Washington a few days later, and unfortunately great sadness struck the Pimlock family as his great uncle Tom died the very next day. So the funeral was arranged for early the week afterwards. Jane and Peter had planned a short visit to Boston while staying in Trenton, but this was not possible. But Peter was honoured to be pallbearer for his great uncle at the funeral. The photograph is the last photograph taken of Great Aunt Lucy, and this was at the wake following the funeral of Great Uncle Tom. Both were aged 79. She passed away the week following when J and P were crossing the Atlantic, about 5 days after Uncle Tom, which was a double sadness for the Pimlock family in Trenton, New Jersey. But at least Jane and Peter were present during this period. When Jane and Peter got to the quayside at New York, they were confronted by the baggage master, who told them that their crate of 8x3x3 was too large to be transported on the QE1. But since there were so few passengers on the boat, they allowed them to take this on board, which was good because it was all their household belonging and, importantly, Peter's golf clubs. But he did ask if Peter was exporting 2 motorcycles, which Peter actually told the baggage master that this was not the case. But anyway, they were allowed to proceed to sail and enjoyed the trip. Jane and Peter had decided to sail from New York to Southampton via Cherbourg on the QE1, which was an experience in itself because it was the largest liner at that time. A ship's log was taken, and the average speed of the ship was 27.8 knots for the 4 days of crossing, which is virtually 30 miles an hour. It did at one time hold the blue ribbon, but this was taken by the SS United States. I'm not sure by the French liner also. But they had said that they couldn't really open up the engines to the full speed because of the fabric of the ship. So it never regained the blue ribbon. On the right hand side, the silhouette is of Jane on the deck of the QE1 during the eastern crossing of the Atlantic from November 24 to 28, 1966, and she was aged 24. The photographer was obviously present, but this is a very nice feature of Jane, and in her first volume, and it was said that this was a photograph of a wonderful person alone on the deck of the largest liner. The years from 1967 to 1989 are termed the intermediate years, and these are years from when Jane and Peter first came to live in Cardiff during 1967, and then resided in Manchester in the Timpley area from 1967 until much later. But the first part of this, from 1967 to 1971, they were without children. Children appeared on the scene between 1972 and 79, and then the period from 1979 to 1989, the children were growing up, and she was beginning to take an interest in council and politics and Labour Party matters. So this period is termed, as I say, the intermediate years. Jane and Peter went away for their only holiday with Jane's mother and father. And they went to the Pembroke area, where Jane's mother and father, friends, had actually become landlord of a pub in Pembroke Dock. And they spent some pleasant few days in this area. On one occasion, they walked down a nature trail to the beach, and while her mother and father were walking along, Jane and Peter ran down to the beach, changed into their swimming outfits, and decided to swim round the coast. Well, the temperature of the water was probably a lot less than it was in New Orleans, but they very much enjoyed this swim. It was a memorable swim to a small cave around the coast. They never thought they were going to be in trouble. It was a very calm day. They were quite reasonable swimmers, always ready to take a dip, and this is a memory that comes flooding back every time I think of Pembrokeshire. Jane and Peter came back from USA and stayed with Jane's mother and father for several months or so until March 1967, when they moved into a house in Westminster Drive, Kincoid, Cardiff. Unfortunately, we were only in this house for 6 months because Peter had got a post in Salford, which Jane was not too happy about because she thought they were going to stay in Cardiff. Anyway, they sold the house around September, October 1967, and Peter commuted between Cardiff and Salford for about 3 months. At the end of 1967, they bought a house at Brook Close, Timperley, and moved in just after Christmas and New Year 1968. The picture here is of the house, which was a new build, and the Blue Mini, which they'd purchased the previous year, which was a car that they enjoyed until just before the first boy was born in 1972. Jane had a dog when she was a young girl, and this dog was a corgi, that Jerry, that Peter and Jane used to take out for walks when they first met. When they came back from the USA and then started residing in Timperley in 1968, Jane found a kitten in the marketplace and brought the kitten home. And this kitten grew up into a large male cat called Smudge, and he lived with them in this house and then later on at Moss Lane, Timperley, until about 1984, about 16 years. He was a notorious cat, but this was the beginning of the whole family having cats until they moved to Priory Road in 2012, where they had their last cat for several years then. So they had a long period of time, 40 something years, of having cats and having kittens on occasion to look after also. This slide gives you an indication of Jane's early sort of experiences and willingness to take the driving seat, particularly when wanting to go somewhere. And in fact, she was the one who drove, and although she had very little experience of driving anywhere without Peter, she on one occasion drove with 3 of her colleagues to Buxton. And Peter was quite nervous about her going there because she was not very good at reading road signs while driving. Where do we go next, or do we come off here, was often the comments he made. Well, the drive was a little eventful because one of the passengers had indicated that she went the wrong side of the traffic lights when turning towards Prestbury from Winslow. On the return journey, the Mini overheated, and somehow Jay managed to get the radiator refilled with water, which amazed Peter when he was told, because he had no idea how she had done this and never got the full story. Another occasion was interesting because Jane, from a very early stage, not like her mother, had an open house sort of image. She would have her house open, sometimes to Peter's dismay, for all sorts of occasions. And one of the very earliest ones was when she was a member of the Women's Association, the academic staff, etc., of the university had a women's association. And she held a social at her own house, which was probably a lot smaller than a lot of the houses the women who came had. Anyway, they were enjoying themselves on this occasion in the lounge, and one person arrived late and failed to get anyone to come to the door. The person in question left, not being able to gain entry and apparently not having the initiative to go around to the back of the house to get someone's attention. Next day, Peter was called to the VC's office in the Maxwell building and informed that the VC had a complaint about the fact one of the women had not been allowed into the social. This is where academic quirkiness comes in, as apparently this particular person and her husband, also at the university, were personal friends of the Vice-Chancellor and his wife. J&P were somewhat astounded by this incident, but recall about an apology is lacking. This incident did not deter J from having social occasions and an open house for all until almost the last days of her life. In 1969, Jane and Peter went for their first holiday in Europe together. They had not been abroad since 1966 when they came back from the USA. They decided on a 9-day tour visiting 4 or 5 countries without advance booking except the ferry. Jane's aunt and uncle lived in Uckfield in West Sussex, and they stayed overnight with them before catching the ferry from Dover at 9:30 the next day. Her uncle was a bit of a home brewer, and Peter got a little bit worse for wear in the evening. That was unfortunate because they had to rise at 6:30 to drive 90 miles to Dover in time to board the ferry at the allotted time. P was not feeling good that, and the 4 hours ferry crossing from Dover to Ostend was particularly rough. When the ferry arrived at Ostend, it had to enter the harbour in reverse before the days of Ro-Ro and rotate through 180 degrees, which meant that at one stage the ship was broadside onto the waves. This caused the ship to rock backward and forward such that the crockery on the tables was sent crashing onto the deck. The thought of having to drive through Belgium to find accommodation looked a bit daunting after this experience, and what is more, they had to negotiate the underpasses through the middle of Brussels to search for a place to stay. In the meantime, they found a small hotel in Namen and remember going to a restaurant where a server in a dark suit proceeded to cook the steak they had ordered, which tasted good, but were never certain that the steaks were not horse meat. The morning after, they drove to Luxembourg and stayed the night in Luxembourg City, right in the centre. Again, they went to a local restaurant and remembered beef stroganoff for the first time. From Luxembourg, they drove into Germany and stopped in the Moselle Valley at a small village in a B&B for 11 marks with no hot water. They recall going to a small restaurant which was about to close and had Moselle to help down Wienersnitz. From the Moselle Valley, they passed through Koblenz and on to the Black Forest, where the Mini started giving trouble by overheating on an incline. They pulled off the road and Peter took off the radiator cap, which was hot, and dropped it into the engine compartment below. With the Mini still overheating, they managed to motor on to Freiburg for sightseeing and stop in the south of Germany at a small town and found a hotel in the centre. They decided to go for a meal at 7 and thought they had adequate time to eat, but the service was slow. The manager announced that the restaurant was closing at 8 to allow guests to attend a street performance of a Shakespeare play, which was possibly Hamlet, in the square immediately outside the hotel. They were somewhat bemused by this action, but there was a bonus, as J and P's bedroom window opened onto the square to give them a full view of the actors performing in the play, which they unfortunately could not understand. Their final day in Germany was Heidelberg, where they stayed in a large Swiss-type chalet and in which meals were served communally on benches. The next day they crossed into France and stayed overnight in Lunéville, Alsace. After the meal in the evening, they went out for a short stroll and were treated to a Salon et Lumière, which was displayed all around the city. The drive across France was quite slow because of the Mini overheating when the speed was much above 30 miles an hour. P had to turn on the heater, which caused Jen some discomfort, so she decided, with considerable relief, to put her shapely legs up on the dashboard for the whole of the journey through northeast France, near to Arras, before they caught the ferry from Calais the next morning. On their return to the UK, Jane and Peter again stayed in West Sussex with Jane's aunt and uncle, and presented them with a bottle of Moselle to consume with the evening meal her aunt had prepared, a gourmet sardine salad. Jane's aunt was not a renowned cook, but at least it was a slimming meal. Jane had a very good friend, Megan Powell, while at school, and they were inseparable. The two of them, as first-year sixth formers, were the gate crashers at the University Hop, where JP met on May 21st, 1960. Whereas Jane was a strong and determined character, Megan was fragile and flighty, which meant that Jay acted as a support through the later school years when Megan had some mental problems. While Jane was training as a physiotherapist, Megan, with decent A levels, had entered Manchester University in 1961 to study arts, including English. J and P returned from the USA in late 1966, and Jane became aware of Megan's mental problems and that they had increased, and she was having to have treatment in a mental institution. During this time, she met up with a young man, John, who also had mental problems. They decided to get married, and Megan asked Jay to be bridesmaid, which she felt obliged to do, as Megan's best pal, although both J and P had reservations about how the two of them were going to cope. The date of the marriage is uncertain. In 1967, when J and P were resident in Cardiff, although it was held at a non-conformist church in Urbana. When J and P moved to Timperley in 1968, although it's not certain how and when it happened and whether there was an official invite, but Megan and John came to stay with J and P at Fallbrook Close, Timperley. This visit became rather difficult for J and P after several weeks because Megan and John appeared not to want to leave, and it looked as though this move was going to be long-term. A decision had to be made, and J and P managed to find a small flat for the couple over a shop in Ashton-on-Mersey. They assisted them in the move, but were saddened and relieved to get them settled into this accommodation. The story ends sadly as Megan's mental state became very severe, and Jay lost contact when she had to be readmitted. What happened to her is unclear, but Jay was possibly aware that she did not survive beyond her early life. This slide shows the wedding of Megan and John, with Jane as the bridesmaid and Peter in attendance. This was a difficult occasion in a way. It was sad, but it had to be joyous in some ways. But Jane was very aware of the difficulties that the couple had from a mental health standpoint. Just before Christmas 1970, Jane's family, were overtaken by a tragedy because her dad died. He had bequeathed himself to St David's Hospital, Cardiff, and so there was no burial, but there was a memorial service arranged where many people attended from the Transport Department and from the RAF Officers' Mess in Cardiff. Christmas is only 9 days away, and that year was extremely difficult at J and P's house. Jane's mother arrived from Cardiff a little before Christmas, and Jay had to think of her mother's loneliness and came to the decision that was to have a profound effect on the family for the next 9 or 10 years. She inquired impulsively about purchasing a dog from a breeder in North Manchester. Having secured the purchase, Jane and her mum drove to the breeder's kennels and collected a dog, what they thought was a small breed of Yorkshire Terrier. This proved not to be the case, as it was discerned later. Peter was not happy with the decision. Why not wait till after Christmas? However, Jane, thinking of her mother's welfare, had thought otherwise. So the tiny puppy, all of 9 inches in length, came to reside at J&P's house over the Christmas period and caused mayhem. On the first night, J&P had made a place for his basket in the kitchen. There he was to stay, but immediately he was left, the whelping started. Because the central heating system was a central air circulating system, any sounds from the kitchen echoed through the vents into the bedrooms. There was not much sleep, and later on Jay's mum decided to have the dog in the bedroom, which unfortunately led to considerable soiling of the fairly new carpet, which continued each night until she returned to South Wales. Christmas dinner was not particularly enjoyed by JP, her mother, John and Sue, and Jill and David, although presents were exchanged. Jane and Peter left to celebrate New Year in Colwyn Bay, and John drove his mother back to Robina. So began the years of intimate motorway swaps of Jay's mum with the dog, normally at Stretcham, at intervals during the year, on many, many occasions. And it was something that Jane and Peter, because of family ties, got over and were able to continue their busy lives. Jane and Peter, for obvious reasons, decided to delay having children until they returned from the USA. So from late 1966 onwards, they were having to try and have a family. And this did not happen. And it was a bit despairing for Jane. She was desperate after a while because all her friends had had children, and they were getting towards about 5 to 6 years being married with no children. And sort of in the period of after Jane's father died to 1971, it was a case of having miscarriages and then hopefully getting things sorted out. Anyway, it happened that she decided to go privately for a consultancy, and the consultant from John Street, Manchester, referred her to Oldham General, where Patrick Steptoe, the renowned expert in fertility, by good fortune had been appointed as the director for the Centre for Human Reproduction in 1969, the previous year. So Jay was admitted for a short period, and P visited her in hospital several times. Her ability to conceive was improved, and Jay did not have to undergo lengthy infertility treatment, which other women attending suffered. And she became aware of some heartbreaking stories of long-term infertility. Fortunately, this was not to be her fate. So the couple were very thankful to Patrick Steptoe for pioneering infertility treatment, and they benefited from the visit to Oldham General. Jonathan was born on January the 15th, 1972. This was almost 7 years after Jane and Peter got married. So they were more than half a decade behind most of their friends in having children. So they were older parents at 29 and 33, which made it almost too difficult for them. And they struggled in the first few months. Jonathan was christened at St George's Church in March 1972, and this picture shows Jane with the family christening gown, with Jonathan dressed in this gown. A later photograph is shown of Jane's sister and mother with Jonathan in the garden in Robina, Cardiff. In July 1972, Jane and Peter decided to visit Shaldon in South Devon, where her mother and father lived before World War II. And they took Jane's mother with her. They had a folding cot which they put on the roof rack of the car that they had. And they had a very nice holiday visiting this area and going to Dartmoor and various other sightseeing areas in the area of South Devon. On the way back, they called in at John and Sue's to say hello on their way back to Cardiff. And the car decided not to restart for a while. It had a problem of condensation on the carburetor, which caused a problem, and that was a feature of these maxi cars. So they had a bit of a wait while the car was sorted out, but they were able to return to Cardiff. There was no motorway then, of course. From the M5 was not open, so they had a longish trip around via Gloucester and around Chepstow to Cardiff. When Jonathan was about 6 months old in July 1972, one day Jane went shopping locally. On making her way along the pavement near to Pickering Lodge on Moss Lane, she came to the edge of the pavement, which had no drop in the curb, and the curb was more than 6 inches in height. Negotiating the curb led to a disaster, as the pram gondola detached itself from the undercarriage and tipped over with Jonathan trapped underneath. Jane was distraught, as when she righted the pram she observed that he had a bleeding lip. She reconnected the pram to the undercarriage and rushed to the surgery a short distance away on Park Road. The split lip was stitched up by the doctor without anaesthetic, and she returned home safely with her injured child. When Peter returned from work in the evening, he was extremely upset to learn of the accident and to see Jonathan with a stitched up lip. However, he was extremely relieved that Jonathan's injury was not more severe. He forgave Jane for not connecting the pram to the undercarriage, and there was no reprimand. Having very young children had its ups and downs, as they were to experience a few times during the period in which the children were growing up, 1970s to 1990s. Jane and Peter and Liz and Nev exchanged visits on very many occasions while the children were growing up. And one of the first occasions was a visit from Peter and Jane to St Leonard's Drive in Claygate, where Liz and Nev lived. And during this period they had a visit to Kew Gardens, and you can see that Matthew, who was born in the USA, and Jonathan, who is a little bit younger than him, are almost like twins. This, as I say, was the first of many to and fro visits, and in fact Liz and Nev were probably, of all their friends, although they lived 200 odd miles away from Jane and Peter in Claygate, were more frequent in their visits backwards and forwards than any other couple that Jane and Peter were involved with. So these had continued to be friends over many years, up to the 1992, when unfortunately Nev died. But Liz continued to support Jane and visit her many occasions since to take up activities in Warden Gardens and also at Peewit Hall School, and also supported her during the mayoral year. So this friendship has continued, and of course, Liz was one of the gang of four physios that trained together 1960 to 61 to 64. Although Jane and Peter had visited John and Sue in Devon with Jane's mother, their first holiday with family, Jonathan, in fact, a year and a half old, wasn't until around July 1973. And as you can see, this was an excellent holiday in the countryside on the edge of Exmoor with John and Sue. You can see Jane with Jonathan and Sue and John on the left hand side, and on the right hand side, obviously, a super picture of Jane with Jonathan, sort of wheelbarrow style, enjoying himself very much. The centre one is a classic picture of a small boy of a year and a half old in the lane going down from Oswald Cottage. And we really revere this picture very much. Jane and Peter had got used to barbecuing when in the USA, where it was really one of those big social occasions. Barbecuing garlic chicken and shrimp and various fish and burgers was a feature of outdoor activities of many Americans. Also, putting marshmallows on the barbecue. When Jane and Peter came home, they brought back a very inexpensive barbecue, but not many people had barbecues back in the 1960s, and this barbecue featured at other friends' events and was even loaned out because other people had not got a barbecue. And it was like an upturned large dustbin lid on wheels with an adjustable height for the grill. In fact, J&P had so many barbecues that they were considered to be the queen and king of barbecuing at that time. It was nothing for them to barbecue for upwards of 40 people because of the large number of burgers and chicken pieces that could be accommodated on the grill at one time. It was big time barbecuing. Until rusting and falling apart, the barbecue survived until the 1980s, but had been well used for over 20 years. Again, the Big Easy, New Orleans, had an influence on their socializing tendencies. Because of the vicinity of the parents of Jane and Peter, about 180 miles apart, Colwyn Bay to Cardiff, there were many occasions on which Christmas and New Year was spent either in Colwyn Bay or in Cardiff or vice versa. One occasion when it was very unique was Christmas at Treetops Penrose Road, when Jonathan was about just under a year old, in fact. And this involves Juliet and Derek and their two children, Phil and Margaret, Jane, Peter's dad, Peter's mum. So this picture is fairly unique of having the Baugh family together with Jane and Peter and Jonathan. Peter had the opportunity to spend a month working at the Max Planck Institute in Mulheim with a group that had a mutual interesting research problem. And unfortunately, Jane was 6 months pregnant in February 1974, with her second child, and she did not want to be left at home and was determined to accompany Peter, and such was an opportunity to go to Germany with their 2-year-old son John. So early February they departed and arrived in Germany and were provided with an apartment which had a very sparse amount of furniture. Peter, with a student, actually got chairs from the institute, carried them down the road to the apartment. While Peter was working at the institute, Jane went shopping, and she walked into the town. Unfortunately, it was downhill going, but very steeply uphill on return. Pete thought the exercise was a bit strenuous for her, carrying their second child, but she coped and repeated the journey almost every day for a whole month. John was not ill and ate well, almost too well, but he developed a bowel problem. And I woke up every morning, needed to go to the loo, which persisted for some days. Clemens von Sontag, from the old establishment of Bavarian, father had been on the Eastern Front in World War II. He diagnosed that what was required was for Jonathan to drink wild bilberries, which turned out to be a German old wives' tale. After this problem had continued for several weeks, finally J and P, in despair, took Jonathan to a local doctor's surgery where the doctor prescribed a child antibiotic on chocolate drops. The problem did clear up in a few days. Jane, at the end of the month's secondment, actually organised her own farewell do, because German socialising was limited to perhaps a few drinks after work in the early evening till about 7 p.m. They were invited to dinner out, but on their departure they did as they did at home, hold a party, inviting colleagues from the institute to their apartment, but in this instance for their own farewell. They arrived home in Manchester from Dusseldorf at the end of the month, with just 6 weeks to go until the birth of their second child, David. This slide shows an early picture of the family in 1974 with David about 3 months old. Jonathan is in the picture, half hidden by Peter's leg. Now, this is a very early photograph of David, and who was born on April of 1974. This slide shows a montage of a few photographs taken during a visit to Woolacombe, the beach. And the top left is of Jonathan with David, 6 months old, in a carry cot, less than 6 months old in fact. And then on the right you've got David with Peter. We've got on the way to Woolacombe, you've got Jane feeding David and Jonathan in front there. And then there's a couple of photos on the beach, and to the left there is a photograph of back at the Oswald cottages of the tractor of the shepherd Bill Vasey, and also a photograph of the garden at Oswald Cottages. When Jane was passing to the shops on the main road in Park, Road in Timberlake. She spotted a house that was set back from the road, and she went past this house several times with Jonathan and David at that time. David only 1 year old, in fact, and came back to see Peter. And she said, "There's a large house which is for sale, and I'd like to consider looking at it." And they were actually in a townhouse which had become too small because Jane's mother was visiting with the dog, and they had only 3 bedrooms, which meant that David had to sleep with them, and Jonathan had a room of his own. Well, they went to see this house, and it had been a nursing home, but a family had moved into it. But it was appalling inside. It was really one of those houses where you needed a lot of work to be done on it. So, but Jane was wanting a bigger house, and I think she was a bit over enthusiastic about the capability of Peter as a DIY expert. It had no ring main upstairs. The power was up from the lower floor. It had no kitchen. It had a scullery with a gas stove in it. There was a bedroom downstairs. There was a corridor with a glass panel overhang, which was typical of Victorian house. The attributes, though, were a sound roof, a tarmac driveway, totally repointed, and central heating. So 37 years began on May the 15th, 1975, and these were wonderful years with plenty of parties, but a lot of blood, sweat, and tears. So the house age changed from 77 to 114 years during the period of their occupation. There are many photographs that can be shown of the family, but this one is particularly spectacular and shows everybody in a very happy mood, including the photographer, who obviously, because of selfies not being possible at that time, not easily possible anyway, um, he is absent from this classic photo, taken somewhere on location in North Devon. In later years, after having spent several holidays in North Devon, a colleague of Peter's at work told him he had a cottage available for rent in um, Dentdale, at Cowgill. And from about 1977 onwards, for some years, the family, first with Jonathan and David, and then with James also, spent very many happy times at this cottage, which originally was not on mains water, and if they wanted fresh water, they had to go to a standpipe in the village and bring up a pail of water from there. But the location of the cottage was spectacular, and they have returned many times, including David and his family, Jonathan and James and Gemma, to this area because it's in the Yorkshire Dales, which are a feature of England, which are beyond comparison elsewhere as a national park. This slide shows two photographs of a fairly unique occasion when Jane and Peter, with Jonathan and David, were aboard an ocean-going yacht, and it was partly owned by John Paxham. And Jane Paxham was actually the school friend of Jane's, who attended their wedding in April the 24th, 1965. Well, John thought that it would be a good idea to go harvesting cockles in the river estuary near Ipswich. So they went on a very calm day, and it was not possible to put the sail up, so they had to use the auxiliary motor. On this occasion, the incoming boat coming towards them took their water, and they got stranded on a sandbank. So John Paxham instructed the boys, that's Julian, John and Jane's son, and Jonathan and David, to run backwards and forwards across the boat to actually free the boat from the sandbank, which they actually did. And after that, they went cockle picking, as you can see on the right, and there's Jane and the three boys there, and Peter, and they're in shallow water on the sandbank, and they're harvesting cockles. Whether they really enjoyed the cockles or not afterwards, I am not sure. In July 1979, Peter and Jane, with the two boys, took a cottage which was owned by Vic and Marion Prickett, who lived next door to them at 123 Moss Lane. Marion had a family house in Thornton le Dale in the Yorkshire Moors, and this was their visit to the Yorkshire Moors, which they very much enjoyed, and it was also an occasion when later in the year, as can be seen from Jane's deportment, that another son, James, was due. So this holiday was interesting from the point of view that Jane, in a sort of a family way, enjoyed this holiday and actually climbed up on Filey Rig near Scarborough with the boys, and it made no difference to her that she was pregnant at the time. They met up with Yvonne and Norman and their children and had fish and chips back in Thornton le Dale, and they went on sort of stormy weather to Scarborough, went to the park there and the actual boating area, and this was an excellent time. Also, they went on the North York Moors, Railway, Goatland, and also went to Hutton Le Hull. So overall, this was a memorable occasion in the Yorkshire moors rather than the Yorkshire Dales. This slide shows a number of photos which were taken in Dentdale and also at Bolton Abbey. The one on the left top is of the boys at their little den called Dingley Dell, where they dammed up. You can see the dam up of the river or the stream, and you can see James is obviously it is 1980 because he's less than 1 year old there, and it's probably around July 1980. But it was an occasion when the boys had gone out early morning and there'd been a downpour overnight. And when Peter got up in the morning, he heard the roar of the River Dee. These are very fast flowing rivers in the Yorkshire Dales, and the roar was tremendously loud, and he suddenly realised when the boys were not in their bed that they'd gone out. And he rushed down to the river and he saw the deluge river. All the riverbed was covered. It was absolutely torrential and almost flowing at probably quite a few knots. And he ran down the riverbank for a few hundred yards, and he said, well, if the boys had come down here, they wouldn't have survived. He was making his way back a little bit exhausted, and guess what? The two boys were up at the hill, outlined against the background of the mountain. And where had they been? They'd been to their favourite place, Dingley Dell, probably to dam up a rapidly flowing stream up there, but they were completely safe. As you can imagine, Peter was very relieved to see them enjoying themselves and tramping along in their Wellington boots without a care in the world. Jane, Peter, and in the first stages, Jonathan, and then Jonathan and David, and then Jonathan, David, and James spent many happy days on holidays, working holidays on many occasions, but a very spectacular place to stay. And they were very fortunate that this cottage was first rented by John and Sue and then bought by John and Sue and taken over by them later on. So this was a feature of their lives, their holiday lives, which enabled them to have experience of the countryside, farming, etc., and also being able to go not too far away to the beaches of North Devon. Peter and Jane and the boys didn't often go away at Easter, but on one occasion they decided to go to Filey. And the boys had enjoyed Scarborough so much that it was a place to go back to, which they really enjoyed because there's fairground there, there's beaches. But when they arrived at Primrose Hill and had an apartment there, it snowed on the first day. So the weather was a little bit cool, but as always, the holidays were full of memories and very much enjoyed. And later on, in fact, when they'd been to France several times, the boys had uttered, "Why can't we go back to Scarborough?" Jane had joined CND in the late 70s, early 80s, and was encouraged by Sue Patchett to join the Labour Party. And then also to actually go with a group of women from Timpley to Greenham Common. And Sue says that they actually went several times. They didn't actually camp overnight, but they joined the women who were camping there and were there at early stages. So these scenes, not necessarily of Jane and Sue, are of the women at Greenham Common protesting against the storage of cruise missiles by the US Air Force, who were based there. And they obviously were protesting against nuclear weapons and wanting them to be ended. The peace camp protest lasted from 1981 to 2000, but Jane was present almost at the commencement of the protest. Jane and Peter went to stay with the boys in 1982 with Jeff and Anne, who had moved to Houston near Paisley as a result of Jeff's job with Ciba-Geigy. And they had a very interesting 5 days there, revisiting Port Seton, and actually the swimming pool was still there, and Jonathan swam in the swimming pool that Jane had swum in when she was a small girl. They also visited Loch Lomond, and as you can see, were swimming in the loch, and obviously in a safe area. It wasn't always the situation for other people more recently, but they managed to stay safe while swimming there. Although not visited often, Northumberland was a spectacular place to go, and during this period they stayed at Wall in a farm cottage and visited homesteads and Vindolanda and Chester Street and all features of the coastal area around and went to the Kielder Reservoir, Kielder Forest, and this was as good a holiday as they had in other places, particularly the Yorkshire Dales. Jane, with James and David, accompanied Peter to a conference on radiation research with John and Joan and Matthew Moore in 1982. And this was an interesting visit for the accompanying persons, because they went to the Anne Frank Museum and they visited a windmill factory which was producing mustard. They went over from Harwich to the Hook of Holland overnight, had a berth, and then took the train from the Hook of Holland to Amsterdam. They stayed all in one room, that is Peter, Jane, David and James, and it was very warm, They stayed near to the Amstel, and this was a memorable holiday for a few days abroad. Although Jane and Peter and the boys had many holidays in North Wales, staying with Peter, mother and father, and also visiting various other places in South Wales, on one occasion they went to West Wales, southwest Wales, and stayed in a wharf building in Cardigan, near the river. And this was a really memorable holiday, as you can see by the photographs that were taken. And they went along the coastal path, which is a feature on the right-hand side, which was spectacular. Went up the coast to Everall to an aquarium, and this was as good a holiday, as I have said before, as any that they had for a week in southwest Wales. And the journey through from Timperley to Cardigan was through the centre of Wales, and the return journey was the same. And of course, this is always a spectacular trip to take. So, one of their holidays was as memorable as any of the others. Jane and Peter and the boys went to France for the second time in 1984, and were going to the Riviera. They booked late, and even with Eurocamp, with a static caravan, they could only get 10 days at Cavalier. So they just stopped, having booked through Eurocamp, at a variety of places, both going and coming back, which enabled them to see parts of France on the way and on the way back. On the way there, they stopped at several places, but one was by the banks of the Rhone, and it was Mâcon, famous for the red wine. And they stayed in the Hotel Europe Angleterre, and it was a chateau. And they had about 4 rooms interconnected for them to be accommodated in. And they had a very good buffet there, and excellent food. So they had a wonderful time in Cavalier when they got there. But Jane, unfortunately, and this has happened previously, left her very good cardigan in the hotel in Mâcon. Well, they decided they'd stop in Mâcon on the way back to retrieve the cardigan. Well, when they came up to just south of Lyon, the autoroute was saturé, as they call it in France. So they decided to come off the motorway and go through the second biggest town, virtually the second biggest town, city in France, and negotiate, no sat-nav at that time, going from South Lyon to North Lyon to get on the N road to go to Mâcon. Unfortunately, they were able to retrieve the cardigan at Mâcon, which was a good thing for Jane, because she had really enjoyed this particular garment. The first appearance of Jane in a yellow mac can be featured on the top of Snowdon. This is one with a fairly big collar, and it was iconic right until almost the last slide of her life in pictures. So this was the start, 1984. So for 36 years, she had a yellow mac which was indicative of her bright and vibrant nature. France for the third time in 1985 and had a two-centre holiday in the Vendée and the Dordogne, and that was because they wanted to see more of the country in France, in various areas of France. And this gave it two areas, one in the seaside, in the Vendée, and in the Vézère Valley. The Vézère was a tributary of the Dordogne. This enabled them to go to prehistoric museums and also visit Lascaux, at the facsimile of Lascaux, not the original. And this was a delightful visit, and again enjoyed very much by the family. During the tour of the UK and Europe, Jet Arthur came to stay for a couple of days with them at Mosley, and they took them to North Wales, as ever, the most picturesque areas of North Wales, such as the Great Orme in Llandudno, and these photographs are taken of Jonathan with Laverne and Jet and Peter, and the photos are taken by Jane. They were extremely fortunate to go to a preview of the Liverpool Garden Festival in 1985, and this was organised by Nev Rees, who was partly responsible for the construction of the facility because he was in the Department of Environment, whose boss was Michael Heseltine. And they went with Liz, Matthew, Daniel, and Eleanor, and had a wonderful time going round in a special train. As you can see, they're in the train on the left-hand bottom, and then they've gone to various areas, including Postman Pat and Galleons, and they generally had a wonderful time. And this was because Liz's husband, Nev, was responsible for in part, for the construction of the facility. As always, Jane had a hand in the activities that the boys and Peter got involved in. This is a picture from 1986, and it's of David on the float, the Astronomy Society float, dressed up as Stormtrooper, with the helmet and costume made by Peter virtually the previous evening, out of various bits and pieces and plaster of Paris and all that sort of thing. So anyway, Jane, as I say, had a hand in making sure that they joined the Astronomy Society by contacting Graham Cliff in the early 80s about joining the Astronomy Society. The advantage of having a large house with a large garden was that the boys could in fact have their own activities organised in their own garden. There was plenty of room for all sorts of games and things like that. On this occasion, they're obviously having a party for themselves, and the photograph is obviously taken by the person who is not in the photograph, and that is Jonathan. So this was the back garden, with the greenhouse, and on this occasion they're obviously having a party outside and enjoying themselves very much by the faces. You can see the grinning faces. Jane and Peter and the boys visited North Wales on many occasions and went to Colwyn Bay, and from Colwyn Bay they could travel all over North Wales. So their grandmother's house, Elsie's house, was at the seafront in Colwyn Bay, and this was used as a base for their travelling around North Wales. They visited North Wales from the time that Jane first was going out with Peter in 1961, and continued to visit until Elsie moved into residential respite care and a residential home in 1999. So a period of 30, almost 40 years was spent going to Colwyn Bay. And on this occasion, it's 1986, and they're in Ayres Park, a favourite place to visit, particularly at that time, the dinosaur world. This year, as you can see, was a particularly interesting year. It was one of the many parties that they had at Moss Lane, and these parties went on for years, Jane hosting the parties. On this occasion, it was interesting from the point of view that it looked as though there was a premonition about Jane becoming a politician. And in fact, on the right hand side, there's someone wearing a face mask, and Colin Patchett is pointing to the person behind the face mask, with Norman Gibbon and Sue looking on. So this was a very interesting occasion. Everybody was enjoying themselves, and particularly Jane must have been considering to be wanting to be a politician, and that was achieved soon after in 1990. From the time that Jane and Peter were in Brook Close, and then following on in Moss Lane, they had family parties at Christmas, and Christmas Day was spent with usually upwards of 10 people, sometimes as many as 17 with them. This was, similar to other people. But Jane was not afraid of having a party and inviting people to party who were not family members, but good friends. And on this particular occasion, around about 1987 to 88, they had mainly family members. Jane hosted parties at other times of the year than Christmas, and on this occasion, you might have said it was a typical dinner party. But it was special in one way because it was all the friends from 2, 6, 8 and 10 Brook Close and 2 Selworth Close, from which Jane had vacated in 1975. You can see that the group includes Vic and Sue, Norman and Jenny, Jeff, Anne, Edith, Nolin Shot, Tony Drinking and Yvonne. 8 to 10 was the norm, but up to, again, 18 with an extra table put on. But this was a special occasion when all the friends from their former residential area were present. Jane and Peter with the boys travelled down to Devon, North Devon particularly, to stay with John and Sue at Orswell Cottage, and travelled around that area and went to the beaches in that area. On one occasion, they decided to go further, and they went to Cornwall and stayed in Hale, near St Ives. Well, this particular holiday was fantastic in one way, in that it started so beautifully on the Friday evening, Saturday evening, I should say, when they got there, and they went as far as Zena Head, and as I say, it was a beautiful evening. The next day was horrendously windy, and they reckoned that the force was force 12, hurricane force, in fact. And they went out during the day to for a walk across the beach from Hale in the direction of St Ives. And on the side of the hill, they actually walked to a small cafe. And to their surprise, the cafe was open. So they were able to have a snack, etc. And when they asked the guy who owned the cafe why it opened, and he said, well, he actually came to see if the actual cafe, a small sort of wooden building, was still there, because the wind was so great. He thought that it may have been blown away. Anyway, it was there, and they could enjoy themselves with a snack in, as I say, horrendously windy conditions, which in fact went on for the whole week, but didn't stop them having a good time going to St Michael's Mount and going to various garden centres and Lost Gardens of Helligan and that sort of contrast, lily gardens, etc. Jane, having been delayed going back to work in the NHS by the birth of James in November 1979, suffered a further delay returning from a holiday in France, 3 days before the two older boys were attending school and James was due to attend the reception class. She received an emergency call from a neighbour in Cardiff informing her that her mother had suffered a TIA and had some loss of speech and movement. She immediately grabbed an overnight bag and drove to Cardiff to stay with her mother, packed a bag for her and returned home the following day. This delay was to last for 3 years until 1987, when her mother died. During this period and previously, she did work part-time at weekends and at other times with Kevin Murphy, the England RFU physiotherapist, who conveniently had a private practice nearby. She had also become active in the Labour Party locally, and in 1988, the year after her mother died, stood as a Labour candidate in Broadheath. Unfortunately, her mother was never to experience Jane's success as a Trafford councillor, but had always encouraged her politically. In 1987, Peter and Jane and the boys attended Peter's mother and father's 50th wedding anniversary at Walkington, the Manor Hotel, in fact, Derek Baugh's hotel. And the whole family were there, including Philip and Margaret and their two children. Peter and Jane and the boys spent another two-centre holiday in the Alps near Briançon in a tent, and then in Picgrome in Port Cremo in a static. And as you can see, in the Alps, they had a wonderful time. There's a great shot of James hacking the ice, and one of David taking a photograph in the Alps. So these were very enjoyable two-centre vacations in 1987. This slide shows several photographs which are enlarged, which were worth doing. One of Jane in a pensive mood in the middle, thoughtfully thinking, and Jane in the Alps on the left-hand side at about 8,000 feet, and James, Jane and Peter with the snow-creviced peaks to the rear. Jane first stood as a councillor for Broadheath Ward in the borough of Trafford in 1988, and as you see, her result was not very good. Broadheath was more Conservative and Labour at that time. She had better success in 1990, but interestingly, we still had a party. celebrating a disappointment in a way, but on the back of one of the photos was written "Local Election Blues." Jane and Peter entertained Lillian, Peter's second cousin, and her friends, who she saw on a number of occasions, um, normally in the Midlands at Stoke-on-Trent. Lillian was the host for Jane before her wedding in 1965, and she visited many times and went to many events with Peter and Jane. And she visited right up until the 1990s, first coming over in the 1940s when she was a Navy commander, and also was at Pearl Harbor after Pearl Harbor had been bombed by the Japanese. In 1988, in July, Jane and Peter went to Bordeaux on a bus, and this was quite a long trip of duration, 23 hours, with a wait at Victoria bus station both directions. Yeah, so they had a very good time there, and particularly Jane had a good time because she went on the tours, at least 3 tours, with accompanying persons at this conference, and cruised down the Gironde on the cruise boat Eleanor, and sailed to the Arcachon Peninsula. Photo I decided it would be a good photo to put on the front of the volume on the intermediate years 1967 to 1989. It's of Jane during her visit to the Arcachon Peninsula, standing on Peerless Dune barefoot, and it was taken by one of the friends she made during the tour, organised for the accompanying persons at the IMSC conference in Bordeaux in 1988. In 1989, there were several reunions. The class of 1964, all graduating from physiotherapy school in Cardiff, and on the left, Jane can be seen with Roy Lane, Sheila Lane's husband. Sheila was one of the physios of the Gang of Four, and on the right, the physio group with Jane on the far left. The second reunion was for Peter in Colwyn Bay, and it was organised by Sylvia Milligan with one of her friends, Beryl. And they were all aged 50, or in that between 1988 and 89. So this was a reunion for everybody from the class of 1950, when they all went to Colwyn Bay Grammar School. Sylvia met Jane there, but she didn't meet Jane again, but followed Jane's council career, and she in fact had lived in Sale and Hale since 1963, almost overlapping with Jane living in Timperley since 1967. Sylvia has kindly donated to the Baugh's Just Giving page in memory of Jane in 2020, and I have been able to take Sylvia to several places, including the Friends of Nature burial ground where Jane's grave is situated. Jane and Peter's final holiday in France with the boys, the 3 boys, was in 1989, and during this holiday they took the 2 bicycles for David and Jonathan on the top of the car, as you can see in the photograph on the top left, and the boys cycled on several occasions around the Pyrenees, which were pretty steep. On one occasion, Jonathan having gone out with David about 11 o'clock in the morning and not reappeared till for 5 hours, suddenly came up the road, and then he said, David's down, he's fairly tired, he's about a half a mile down the road. So Jonathan, being fitter, cycled on up to the top of the mountain above where they were staying. Peter, in the meantime, went to get David, who he found drooping over his bicycle, and took him back to the house. But they enjoyed themselves in various places. They were in the Basque country with a Basque family, went out to a Basque evening of song and dance, and watched them playing pelota, the local war game. But they also went at a 120-mile round trip to Mimizan Plage, which was a favourite beach. Went several times during the fortnight they were there. And this was an excellent holiday in every way. The video, which is finished at this point, is for the years 1960 to 1989 and follows the 2 volumes of Jane's life which have been published, 1960 to 66 and 1967 to 89. The video of the council years 1990 to 2019 is a follow-on from this video and provides a separate episode of Jane's life in pictures. The YouTube videos being produced, if they had been from 1960 to 2019, would have been too long, and therefore it has been separated into 2 separate videos.